Welcome back to the Deep Dive. This is where we take the most complex and tangled knots of modern public life. The things that make you just scratch your head and ask, why are people reacting that way? And we pull them apart thread by thread to try and figure out what's really happening beneath the surface.
Today's dive is a fascinating one, and it's not so much because of the specific subject, but because of the underlying psychological conflict it just perfectly exposes.
Yeah.
The source material we've gathered revolves around a really difficult and uncomfortable situation. I mean, it's a truly classic ethical dilemma, but it's currently disguised as a celebrity scandal.
And the core conflict, the jumping off point for this, was actually brought to us by a listener whose observation was incredibly sharp. The specific case involves a well-known left-leaning actor. Now, this person publicly admitted to a serious crime he committed in his youth.
And we're talking about sexual assault and violence.
Right. After the truth came out, he chose to take a moral step away from the spotlight, to retire. He accepted full responsibility for his past actions.
And you'd think that would be it, right? The confession, the retirement. That should have been the end of the public conversation. The person at fault confessed and accepted the consequence.
But that's not what happened. And this is what the listener noted, something really crucial. A significant, very vocal portion of his supporters insisted that he should absolutely not retire.
They were telling him he should, in fact, be proud, that he shouldn't apologize or concede at all.
And here's where it gets so interesting, and this is the question you raise. It's really the heart of our dive today. Why do people deny accountability? Why do they fight for a perpetrator when the person himself has confessed and voluntarily chosen the high ground of social responsibility? It looks like a complete moral paradox.
It does, but it's rarely, if ever, about the individual actor himself. Our mission today is to move beyond the celebrity and really analyze the profound psychological and, tribal mechanisms that are operating in the public sphere. The ones that compel these supporters to fight harder for the perpetrator than the perpetrator fights for himself. This whole phenomenon is like a textbook study in group identity and self-justification.
Okay, so we're not just talking about individual denial. This is a mechanism that operates on a mass scale. So what's our roadmap for pulling this apart?
Well, we're going to move from the individual brain all the way up to the political battlefield. We'll unpack this using 4 key frameworks that were laid out in the source material. First, we'll look at how cognitive dissonance forces the individual mind to sort of twist reality to survive.
Okay.
Second, how in-group bias escalates this into a full-scale tribal war. Third, the deliberate effort of moral decoupling, separating the skill from the sin. And finally, we'll connect all of this to that ancient societal dilemma of balancing a leader's ability versus their moral character.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start with the smallest unit here. The individual brain and the psychological shields we all put up when our heroes stumble, I think.
Well, I think all of us have experienced that really sharp, painful feeling of disappointment when someone we admire, whether it's for their art, their politics, whatever, turns out to be deeply, fundamentally flawed.
Right.
The source material explains this feeling not as simple disappointment, but as a core conflict deep inside the supporter's psyche. It's called a psychological emergency. Cognitive dissonance.
That's the engine. That is the engine driving this entire phenomenon of denial. Cognitive dissonance is that deep, almost unbearable internal discomfort that happens when 2 of your fundamental beliefs, or a belief and an external reality, are in conflict.
It's the brain just screaming for consistency.
It is. And in this case, the conflict is just. It's absolutely stark. You have the supporter's core identity. I am a good, moral, ethical person who believes in justice and supports victims. That identity clashes violently with the new external reality. I support and have spent years admiring an admitted sexual offender. Wow. Yeah, that's a moral crisis right there. You can't sustain that.
You cannot hold those 2 truths at the same time without feeling like a massive hypocrite, or at least starting to question your own core values and all your past decisions. So to resolve this, the brain, which is, hardwired to seek consistency and get rid of this discomfort, it has to change something.
And the research highlights that you basically have 2 options to get out of that dissonance. Option 1 is to change your behavior. So you stop supporting the actor, you admit your past judgment was wrong, and you can see that you are backing a terrible person.
But the sources note that retracting support for someone you've been loyal to for years, it's extremely painful. It damages your self-image. It forces you to admit you made a huge error in judgment, which might reflect poorly on your own moral compass.
The cost of admitting I was wrong is just too high for the ego.
It often is. So if changing the behavior is too painful, the brain instinctively goes for option two. You change the belief or the perception of the reality itself. Instead of changing how you feel about the actor, you change how you feel about the crime.
You rewrite the story.
Precisely. The external facts, the confession, the victim's trauma, they suddenly become malleable. And this shows up in two very specific and powerful rationalization strategies that we see supporters use almost immediately after the news breaks.
Okay, so let's start with the first one you mentioned, crime minimization.
This is the strategy of just shrinking the gravity of the offense. Instead of calling it sexual assault and violence, which is what it was, supporters reduce it. They'll say things like, oh, it was just a mistake when they were young, or an isolated lapse in judgment.
Right, they use euphemisms. They use language to make the crime sound small, accidental, almost incidental to the adult they are now.
Yes. They treat a life-altering traumatic crime like a reckless driving ticket or an overdue library book. It's a way of psychologically downplaying the severity to make their continued support feel okay.
They're essentially trying to convince themselves, and everyone else, that it wasn't the real him, or that the event itself wasn't as severe as the label sexual assault implies.
That's the narrative construction. It's required for self-justification. Then you get the second rationalization, which is equally crucial in this specific case, and that's debt cleansing. The source material highlights the fact that the offender was categorized as a juvenile offender, or anon in the original context, and that he had served time in juvenile detention.
Okay, so this is where the legal history gets twisted into a kind of moral shield. The time he served is used to argue that the slate is now completely, totally wiped clean.
Exactly. The supporter argues that the legal punishment acted as a complete moral antidote. He paid the debt to society. It's over. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. The sources connect this defense directly to something called the just world hypothesis.
That's the psychological theory, that people have this deep-seated need to believe the world is fair, right? That good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people.
Yes. Supporters are driven by the belief that the world should be fair. And in a really twisted application of this hypothesis, they argue he already received the punishment juvenile detention, therefore forcing social consequences like career retirement 20 years later is unjust. It's unfair double jeopardy.
So they're not even defending the person's crime anymore. They're defending their own perception of a fair world.
That's it. If the world is fair and he paid the debt, then any new punishment is inherently irrational and cruel. It's a highly rationalized defense mechanism designed purely to protect the supporter's decision to keep supporting him.
That helps us understand the individual's internal survival mechanism. But this denial gets weaponized when it moves out of one person's head and into a group dynamic. We see this in the fierce defense mounted by entire fan communities and political factions. This is in-group bias, the political tribe.
Absolutely. When you have strong political affiliations or these deep fandoms, the source material notes that they function as powerful tribes or political factions. And this activates our most fundamental in-group bias. We are inherently, biologically hardwired to be more generous, more forgiving, and more protective toward members of our own group.
So if that celebrity is strongly associated with your political camp, let's say the left, as the sources describe, conceding his guilt isn't just admitting one person made a horrible mistake. It feels like admitting a moral or intellectual defeat for your entire ideology in the culture war.
It becomes a moral defeat for our entire camp. The defense of the flawed individual is no longer about the actor's personal integrity. It's about protecting the group's moral and political reputation against the outside world, an outside world that is, inherently perceived as hostile and always looking for weaknesses to exploit.
That psychological shield is why we see such aggressive, almost frenzied defense of public figures whose actions are, by any other measure, morally indefensible.
Right. And this tribal lens completely reframes the actor's own actions. His retirement, which he himself declared was an act of contrition and social responsibility, can't be accepted as that by the tribe.
Why not?
Because in the logic of tribal warfare, supporters cannot tolerate the idea of one of their own voluntarily conceding moral weakness. That signals surrender to the enemy, therefore they have to reinterpret the retirement. It wasn't a voluntary act of contrition, it was a forced martyrdom or a witch hunt.
So they see the exposure and the public pressure as an attack orchestrated by the opposition or the hostile general public.
Yes, that switch in interpretation is devastatingly effective. If it's a witch hunt, then the correct tribal response isn't sorrow or reflection.
It's radical, aggressive defiance.
Exactly, and that is why they shout, "Be proud, don't step down." It's because they view the whole situation as external aggression against their faction. The defense is a direct, visceral reaction aimed at the perceived opposing camp, not a logical argument about the actor's past actions. It's power dynamics expressed through the language of moral indignation.
And layered on top of all this tribalism, we have one final, crucial coping mechanism, one that is absolutely essential for the continued viability of public figures: moral decoupling. This is the deliberate effort to separate the skill from the sin.
This one requires a really sophisticated level of psychological maneuvering. It's the conscious effort to split the individual into two functional parts. There's the part with the ability, his acting skill, his societal contributions, his political correctness on other issues. And then there's the part with the private life, which contains the past crime or immorality.
This is the classic, and I have to say, sometimes tempting plea: judge the art, not the artist. We all want to keep enjoying the output without having to deal with the moral complexity of the person who made it.
And in this specific context, the source material shows supporters leveraging the fact that the actor may have made many positive, good statements publicly, and that he is, undeniably a talented figure. They use this successful, articulate adult persona to completely offset the past transgression.
But the sources highlight a specific key phrase that makes this decoupling possible, and that's the label, the juvenile offender.
Yes.
Why does that specific label carry so much power in enabling this moral separation?
Because it provides the ultimate, ready-made psychological justification for the split. It allows supporters to completely separate the immature mistake of the past, which they can blame on youthful recklessness and underdeveloped judgment, from the distinguished, mature adult of the present. In their minds, the two selves are fundamentally different beings.
So the argument basically becomes, the person who committed the crime no longer exists.
Precisely. They argue that the current mature person, who may be a great contributor to culture or to political causes, cannot be held justly responsible for the actions of their former immature self. They believe it is inherently unjust to let the past life destroy the present life. If they can frame the crime as a flaw of development rather than a flaw of character, the current person is absolved.
It's a fascinating, if deeply cynical, strategy of self-preservation for the supporters. I mean, it's so clear that defending the individual is really an act of self-defense for the supporters' own identity and their group loyalty.
Now that we understand the psychological drivers behind the denial, we can sort of transition to the broader societal question that the listener is raising, and it's one that touches on governance, on business, on culture. When we evaluate a leader, be it a political figure, a CEO, or a major celebrity who acts as a moral bellwether, which is truly more important, excellent ability or flawless moral character.
This is the profound dilemma that just haunts every election, every corporate scandal. And it's not a new conflict. I mean, humanity has been grappling with this fundamental tension for centuries, philosophically.
Yes, and philosophically what we're witnessing here is the clash between two major ethical schools that are completely opposed in their starting point: utilitarianism and virtue ethics.
Okay, so let's break that down. Like, in simple terms, what's the clash there?
Utilitarianism is the ethics of results, the philosophy of the outcome. It asks a simple question: does this person's action or presence produce the greatest positive benefit for the greatest number of people? So if a person is personally immoral, maybe they cheat on their taxes or are deeply flawed in their private life, but they are incredibly effective at leading the country out of an economic crisis, a utilitarian might reluctantly support them. Ability and positive outcome are paramount.
The ends justify the means.
Essentially, yes. Now, virtue ethics is the opposite. It focuses on the person's character, their inherent nature. It asks, does this person embody the qualities we, as a society, value? Honesty, integrity, justice. If the leader's character is flawed, even if their policies are functionally good, their ability to lead is compromised because they fail as a moral role model. The character itself is the foundation of authority.
So we have a society that's constantly pulled between wanting effective results, which is utilitarianism, and wanting trustworthy character, virtue ethics. And in the messy real world, the sources suggest that the deciding factor often boils down to a really practical concept: job relevance.
That is the essential filter. The societal standard for morality is highly dependent on the nature and requirements of the leader's position. So we really need to look at the case studies provided, the political leader versus the business leader, because the moral bar is set at a fundamentally different height for each.
Let's start with the highest office, the political leader, like a president or prime minister.
The requirements here are, well, they're comprehensive. The source states the president is not just an administrator or a policymaker. They are first and foremost a symbol of the nation's identity and its values. Their core requirement is achieving legitimacy and public trust to govern effectively.
That's a crucial distinction. A significant moral flaw in a political leader, say, a powerful past crime like sexual assault in our case, or even something less criminal but still morally dubious like widespread adultery or just endemic lying, it doesn't just hurt their private life, it fundamentally destroys the foundation of their authority.
Exactly. A significant moral flaw in a symbolic leader fundamentally damages their governing legitimacy, even if their policy skills are excellent. If the people cannot trust the core character of the person, if they see them as a hypocrite or a danger, every good policy they enact will be met with resistance, cynicism, and opposition that just undermines the policy's effectiveness. So, for a political leader, high morality is considered an intrinsic, non-negotiable part of the job requirement.
Okay, now let's contrast that with the business leader, like a big tech CEO. Their mission is much, much narrower and more measurable.
Right. Their primary duty is explicitly defined by law. Fiduciary duty, which means maximizing shareholder value and generating profit. Their worth is measured by results, specifically the bottom line. The sources cite figures like Steve Jobs or Elon Musk, noting they are often figures who had or have reputations for personality flaws, difficult management styles, or complex private lives.
But the market, and often the board of directors, seems to tolerate these flaws. Why is that?
Because their abilities generated massive financial success and wealth. Their private flaws are tolerated unless that flaw directly, measurably harms the company's interest. The source makes a key, powerful distinction here. A CEO is typically removed for incompetence, failing to protect the business, triggering a stock crash, or causing a major brand boycott, not strictly for private immorality. Morality matters only insofar as it impacts profitability in that specific sphere.
And we even see fascinating global contrasts in how different cultures weigh those private flaws, especially when they don't involve violence.
Oh, absolutely. The sources bring up the example of political tolerance for extramarital affairs in some European countries, notably France, versus the stricter standards in the US or South Korea. The source mentions President Mitterrand, whose acknowledged extramarital child and related secret life did not significantly derail his political career.
In that cultural context, the attitude seems to be, well, we hired him to run the country, not to run his marriage.
Yeah.
The private life is kind of compartmented away from the public duty.
Exactly. But in societies with stronger virtue ethics traditions and a greater focus on the leader as an integrated moral role model like the US or Korea, private flaws, even if they seem unconnected to the job, are viewed as an absolute breach of trust. The question that gets asked is, if a person breaks a fundamental private promise, like a marriage vow, how can they possibly be trusted with the national promise or the public treasury? The expectation is that character is unified.
Beyond the role, though, the nature of the flaw itself must be critical. I mean, not all moral failings are equally disqualifying, even for a CEO.
Absolutely not. You have to perform a rigorous relevance check on the moral flaw. If the past crime was something like fraud or embezzlement, that person is fundamentally unsuitable for any financial or administrative role. Why? Because the flaw directly attacks the core duty of financial stewardship and honesty. The job requires integrity with money.
But what about the specific crime in our case? Sexual assault or violence? It doesn't necessarily make someone a bad actor or a poor economic policymaker or a technically incompetent software engineer.
You're right, it doesn't diminish technical competence. But the source stresses that in modern society, this type of flaw is fatal to two huge components of modern leadership: organizational culture and brand image. We are living in an era where ESG, environmental, social, and governance, is paramount.
Social and governance, that's the key.
A leader with a history of violence or sexual assault instantly destroys trust. It damages the organizational culture for all employees, especially women, and becomes a massive liability that can trigger boycotts, talent exodus, and regulatory scrutiny. In the modern business environment, that historical fact is inherently disqualifying, regardless of technical skill, because it threatens the social viability of the entire organization.
So the standards are constantly tightening, constantly evolving, driven by this societal moral sensitivity. But if we have to make the brutal choice between a brilliant jerk and a moral incompetent, how does society ultimately decide?
The sources offer a conclusive criterion that often governs these decisions in practice: replaceability. This kind of synthesizes the entire dilemma. It brings utilitarian concerns crashing back down to earth.
Tell me more about that. How does replaceability operate as a criterion?
Well, the decision often comes down to the assessment of alternatives. If the leader is deemed truly irreplaceable during an existential, desperate crisis, think of a wartime general whose unique, unconventional strategy is the only viable path to victory, then ability triumphs. The public, driven by the utilitarian concern for survival, will hold its nose and choose the competent but morally flawed individual.
Because survival is the first priority. But that window for tolerating a flawed genius, it must shrink rapidly once the crisis passes.
Absolutely. In times of peace, or if perfectly competent and morally sound alternatives exist, the scale tips dramatically. Morality and public trust become paramount. The source points out that a leader's authority ultimately flows from a sense of moral superiority. And as ethics become a core component of modern business competitiveness, that ESG focus we mentioned, the window of opportunity for morally flawed but capable leaders just keeps shrinking. Society is increasingly willing to trade some competence for character if survival isn't immediately at stake. We value the moral coherence of the community more than the singular brilliance of one toxic individual.
We have to now focus really deeply on the gravity of the specific crime involved in the sources, sexual assault and violence, because this type of harm introduces a dimension that just fundamentally changes the entire conversation. It's the direct conflict between the ideal of offender rehabilitation and the brutal, perpetual reality of victim suffering.
This is the critical juncture where the well-intentioned defense of the juvenile offender completely breaks down. The supporters lean so hard on the ginseng or rehabilitation argument.
Which is an appealing argument, right? It's built on a fundamentally optimistic belief that people can change and deserve redemption.
Exactly. The supporters' argument, which is detailed in the sources, is highly legalistic and rooted in that optimism, they say. The actor paid the debt via juvenile detention. He has lived for 20 years as a mature, contributing citizen. To continue punishing him socially decades later is argued to be cruel, and it negates the entire value and goal of his rehabilitation. They operate on the premise that redemption must equal social restoration.
That premise sounds good in theory. But as the listener noted, it just crashes headlong into the victim-centric challenge. And this is the crucial point about the irreversibility of the harm.
That is the crux of the dilemma. For grave crimes like sexual assault or murder, the injury is fundamentally irreversible. The traumatic experience cannot be undone, even with the passage of time or the offender's personal success. The victim's trauma is often perpetual. Their life was permanently altered and shadowed, regardless of the offender's personal repentance or career trajectory.
So, even if the offender is genuinely remorseful and lives a perfect, productive life for 20 years, they can't erase the injury. The healing process for the victim is not a matter of simply waiting out the clock on the perpetrator's remorse.
And this creates a profound social imbalance that has to be addressed. The source emphasizes the painful, tangible reality here. The actor enjoyed 20 years of a successful celebrity life, accumulating fame, wealth, and public adoration. Meanwhile, the victim likely suffered in silence, carrying the trauma, possibly dealing with PTSD, depression, or isolation.
So the supporters demand for the actor to be proud and return to the stage. It feels less like an act of forgiveness and more like a demand for the victim to silently accept the perpetrator's celebrated success.
It is exactly that. Forcing forgiveness or demanding social acceptance based solely on the perpetrator's personal remorse without genuinely acknowledging the victim's perpetual pain is viewed by critics as secondary victimization. It re-traumatizes the victim by validating the individual who caused the original harm and telling the victim that their pain should be secondary to the perpetrator's career.
And this brings us to the unique burden of being a public figure. An actor's career relies entirely on public trust, love, and the projection of a positive, aspirational character.
That reliance means the required moral standard is non-negotiable. A history of sexual violence permanently destroys that trust. It makes their continued employment a moral liability that extends far beyond the stage or the screen. The source states that regardless of acting talent, a history of sexual violence permanently destroys the required trust.
And on top of that, the success itself becomes a problem.
Precisely. The social critique is that a successful sexual assault perpetrator, becoming a national role model, constitutes a severe form of second-degree victimization toward the general public and all other victims of similar crimes. It sends a message that justice is conditional upon talent and fame, prioritizing celebrity rehabilitation over victim safety and dignity. This is why the job is, in the end, socially untenable.
So the actor's own decision to retire, regardless of external pressure, is viewed in the sources as a recognition of this social contract.
Yes, it is presented as an acknowledgement that he cannot meet the heightened standard of public trust required for his job, separate from his legal accountability 20 years ago. This decision, though painful for him and his fans, is framed by the sources as a necessary and appropriate act of social responsibility, recognizing the irrevocable nature of his past actions and the public's right to safety and trust in its role models.
Now, we have to address the political reality that sometimes drives these revelations. The listener noted that the exposure of this past crime may have been politically motivated, perhaps released by a hostile faction to damage the actor's political camp. Does the motive behind the exposure change the required social responsibility?
That is a critical ethical and political question, and the source material provides a very clear-eyed answer. Even if the revelation of the past crime was politically motivated, driven by malice, or strategically timed, the central fact of the crime remains true. The legal and social responsibility remains fundamentally with the perpetrator. The public judgment and the destruction of public trust cannot be avoided once the true facts are known in the public domain. The motive of the whistleblower is secondary to the truth of the offense. The actor is responsible for his actions, not for the timing of the leak.
Okay, so we've established that individual and tribal psychology compel people to defend their own. Now, we need to zoom out to the political arena where the sources expose a profound societal cynicism driven by the wildly inconsistent application of moral standards. The listener pointed out that groups often apply radically different ethical standards to their own members versus their opposition.
And this inconsistency is a contagion. It is incredibly corrosive to genuine public trust and social cohesion. The first factor driving this confusion is the rapidly shifting moral ground, what sociologists sometimes call culture lag.
What exactly is lagging? The culture, or our understanding of the culture?
Both, in a way. The standards for acceptable social conduct, particularly around gender sensitivity, sexual harassment, and assault, have shifted so rapidly and dramatically in modern society, especially in the last decade. Historically, we often emphasize the perpetrator's intent. Did I mean to offend? Was I just joking? Today, the social standard often focuses almost entirely on the impact or the victim's feeling.
That is a fundamental, profound shift. It moves the moral locus from the perpetrator's head to the victim's experience.
And the result of that rapid shift is immense confusion and defensiveness. The sources mention the confusion felt by many, particularly older individuals, who grew up with an entirely different set of social norms. They feel they are unfairly targeted, that they're being labeled as potential perpetrators because behavior once considered a friendly joke is now a firing offense. They don't have a new rule book, and they feel like the goalposts are constantly moving.
But the true damage to societal trust, it comes from the political groups who champion these new high standards, often very loudly, but then fail spectacularly to meet them themselves. This is the paradox of selective justice.
This is the core critique the listener leveled at the modern political environment. The system's hypocrisy is just glaringly exposed when groups that usually claim moral superiority on issues like gender sensitivity or human rights apply radically different standards when the perpetrator is their own leader or member.
And the source material details a specific, deeply problematic example involving a political faction trying to minimize a serious assault claim against their own senior leader. This involves some highly charged political jargon.
Yes. In this specific context, the political faction avoided calling the person who experienced the assault a victim. Instead, they coined and used this highly specific and deliberately minimized term, complainant or person claiming damage. This was not a random choice of words. This was semantic warfare.
Why does that specific term complainant represent such a profound act of political manipulation and betrayal?
Because the entire movement of victim-centric justice is built on the premise of believing and validating the victim's experience. By labeling the person a complainant or someone merely claiming to be damaged, the political faction achieved two things instantly. First, they minimized the severity of the act, framing it as an unproven allegation rather than a validated experience. And second, and crucially, they created a linguistic distance between the experience and the political apparatus, discrediting the claim when the perpetrator was their leader.
That is a staggering contradiction of the very victim-centric principles they usually preach when the opposition is involved. It's an act of profound intellectual dishonesty.
It is the ultimate betrayal of those principles. And these actions often included supporters engaging in overt second-degree victimization, actively attacking the victim's character, claiming she was part of a political conspiracy or had malicious intent. These are the very behaviors that groups advocating for gender sensitivity usually fight hardest against, but they deployed them mercilessly when their own power was threatened.
So, the result is that the public looks at this blatant reversal of standards and concludes that the principles themselves aren't universal moral tenets, but merely weapons to be deployed against the enemy.
And that realization leads directly to the weaponization of legal principles. The standards switch instantly, depending on which side the alleged perpetrator belongs to. It's a cynical mechanism of political survival.
So if the opposition errs, what's the immediate battle cry from the political rival?
It's a demand for immediate moral and social judgment. The victim's tears are evidence. Resign immediately. We must believe the victim. They apply the most aggressive, fast-acting version of social justice available. They demand that the political figure be condemned and removed before due process can even begin.
But when our side errs, when the person under scrutiny is a member of the defending faction,
The defense instantly shifts to invoking the highest legal standards, the presumption of innocence, and demanding due process and evidence-based justice. Suddenly they become these fierce champions of the rule of law, demanding mountains of evidence before conceding an inch of moral ground. They champion the rights of the accused, who just so happens to be one of their own.
the conclusion is unavoidable then. This inconsistency suggests that values like human rights, gender sensitivity, ethics, they're not used as universal principles, but strategically as weapons or tools for political power struggle. This confirms the listener's observation that politics is often about power retention, not national welfare.
Indeed. The source material notes that this hypocrisy fosters a massive amount of public cynicism because it leads people to believe that ethics are just a cynical game. As the source states, using an analogy, if you hang it on your nose, it's a nose ring. If you hang it on your ear, it's an earring. No moral standard is fixed. They are only utilized to maximize the attack on the enemy. For genuine social trust to build, the source concludes, a group must be willing to apply an even more rigorous standard to its own members. But that is the last thing we ever see in power struggles.
We've established that this tribalism and selective morality are highly problematic, highly destructive. Now, we have to address the listener's final, more challenging assertion that we may never fully escape this us versus them framework, because it's hardwired into our biology and the fundamental nature of power struggles.
The listener's insight, which connects political failures to deep-seated evolutionary biology, is remarkably accurate. We need to begin by looking at the brain as a machine that's just trying to save energy. Social psychologists call this the cognitive miser theory.
That sounds like a derogatory term for the human brain. I mean, we don't want to think of ourselves as mentally lazy.
It's not derogatory, not really. It simply means the brain prioritizes efficiency above all else. Our brain's instinct to categorize people and information, left, right, friend, enemy, safe, dangerous, is an essential mechanism of cognitive efficiency that saves precious mental energy. We have limited cognitive resources, and we have to simplify complex input to function.
Okay, let's put this in evolutionary terms. Why is efficiency a survival mechanism?
Well, consider the logic of survival in the wild. If you hear a rustling sound in the bushes, you don't have time to spend 10 minutes meticulously analyzing whether it's the wind, a small harmless rabbit, or a tiger. You instantly categorize it as threat or non-threat, and you act fast. That rapid, energy-saving decision-making process is absolutely necessary for physical survival. It allows us to simplify complex input into manageable categories.
But when you apply that efficient binary categorization, friend or enemy, to the complex, nuanced world of political and social issues, what happens?
It results in harmful oversimplification and rigid labeling. Instead of evaluating a rival politician's 20-year career, their complex policy positions, and the societal trade-offs involved in their decisions, we simply label them left or right, good or bad. This saves enormous cognitive energy, but it eliminates empathy, nuance, and understanding, thereby reinforcing rigid us versus them political tribalism.
Once that rigid division is set, our brains start treating the opposition not just as rivals, but almost as less than fully human. This is the concept of dehumanization and the lack of empathy that follows.
Psychologically, we begin to grant less mind perception, less capacity for complex emotion, consciousness, warmth, or human struggle to the opposing political group. The sources emphasize that we see them as simpler, less nuanced beings, driven by single, base motivations.
The source mentions the infrahumanization effect. How does that actually manifest in everyday politics?
We view the opposition as simple, machine-like, or purely motivated by primitive, negative drives, greed, anger, or blind, irrational dogma. They are not seen as complicated, well-intentioned humans grappling with difficult choices, but as the embodiment of an evil principle. This psychological distance is critical because it makes it so much easier to attack them without feeling personal guilt or remorse.
It's a strategy that mirrors wartime psychology, reducing the enemy soldier to an abstract target, or a machine, rather than a human being with a family.
It is the exact same mechanism. If they are less than fully human, their rights and their struggles suddenly matter less. When a member of the opposition is the victim of a political attack or even a personal crime, we can dismiss it more easily because they are just an enemy receiving their due. Conversely, when a member of our group is a victim, it is seen as an outrage against humanity itself. The moral weight changes completely based on the label.
This inherent tribalism brings us to a bleak but powerful political philosophy that seems to validate the listener's cynicism about the true underlying nature of power.
We have to turn to Carl Schmitt's definition of politics. Schmitt, a very controversial but profoundly influential political theorist, famously defined the essence of politics not by policy or administration, but by the ultimate distinction between enemy and friend.
That definition just strips away all the idealistic language about public service, national welfare, and universal human rights, doesn't it?
It does. For Schmitt, if morality is the distinction between good and evil, and aesthetics is beautiful versus ugly, politics is simply friend versus foe. It's the ultimate identification of Osho, or us versus them. Everything else is secondary to that one distinction.
So in this ruthless framework, where do things like justice, human rights, and ethics actually fit in for the political actor?
According to this view, they are not ends in themselves for politicians. They are merely tools or weapons and flags used strategically to solidify the in-group's unity and to attack the out-group's vulnerability. When championing human rights against the opposition serves to gain power, a politician champions human rights. When enforcing morality internally threatens power, they instantly ignore or dismiss the moral principle.
And this explains why internal moral cleansing, the political faction punishing its own wrongdoers, is so rare and so difficult. This is the iron rule of power.
It's the ultimate zero-sum game logic. If you are engaged in a fierce existential struggle for survival and power, you simply cannot afford to rigorously enforce morality on your own members. The source material uses a powerful military analogy. Punishing a capable general during wartime for a moral shortcoming, like theft or adultery, would be viewed by the faction not as an act of justice, but as an act of treason that aids the opposition by weakening the camp.
Because power struggles are zero-sum. If we weaken ourselves through moral self-correction, we inherently strengthen the enemy.
Exactly. This is why political groups have a primal, almost instinctual defense mechanism to close ranks and dismiss or minimize internal wrongdoing, like the sexual assault case we discussed. The expectation that political figures speak for all the people is often an illusion. In reality, they often speak only for the people who vote for us. They are agents of their tribe first.
It is a sobering, even dark, conclusion. The desire for leaders to hold themselves to a higher universal standard is, well, it's idealistic, but it's inherently opposed by the biological and political realities of power struggle and tribalism. We are hardwired to categorize, and politics is hardwired to exploit and weaponize those categories. This has been a deeply insightful, if slightly challenging, deep dive. We started with one single frustrating observation, a guilty person being defended by their supporters, and we tracked that phenomenon all the way through the psychological forces that justify it, the profound societal dilemmas of competence versus character, and finally, the ancient, ugly realities of political tribalism.
We covered how cognitive dissonance forces the brain to minimize serious crimes through rationalization and the just world hypothesis, how moral decoupling allows us to separate talent from immorality using the convenient excuse of the juvenile offender label, and the profound, unavoidable conflict that arises because of the irreversibility of severe harm, which cannot be erased by the perpetrator's career success.
And crucially, we noted that the failure of political groups to apply universal standards has exposed the contagion of hypocrisy, leading to immense public cynicism as legal and ethical principles are used as political weapons, like coining the term complainant, rather than as universal moral guidelines.
The essential synthesized takeaway here for you to think about is that the aggressive defense of the guilty individual, whether it's the actor in our case or a corrupt politician, is usually an act of self-preservation for the supporter's own identity and tribal loyalty. It's not necessarily for the individual being defended.
Right. The fight is not about the celebrity's past, but about the supporter's present identity and their team's moral scoreboard.
Exactly.
That makes the fight comprehensible, even if it's disappointing. The fight is always about the identity of the person doing the supporting. And that leaves us with a final provocative thought to mull over as you navigate the political noise of the modern world. If the current trend of ethics as a weapon continues, where moral principles are only rigorously enforced against the opposition and discarded internally, what long-term cost will our society inevitably pay in terms of genuine social trust and universal moral agreement? Will the constant cynical manipulation of ethics eventually lead to a state of total nihilism where no one believes in any universal principle at all? Think about that until our next deep dive.